Well, good morning. As soon as Jim Doltmeyer is finished with his story, we'll get started with class. Yeah. Hopefully everybody had a good opportunity to catch up with everyone, allowing a little extra time this morning in between service and class. So good to see everybody here this morning. We're going to continue our study of Daniel chapter, up to now chapter 10. Chapter 10, I would say, probably toward the second half of the book of Daniel is the easy one, so to speak. So we're actually going to get slightly into chapter 11, get a couple of those verses through before we get to hopefully a stopping point where I've anticipated the stopping point to be. But Daniel chapter 10 is essentially the setup for chapter 11, and it's kind of the vision that chapter 11 is going to be. This is kind of how it comes to Daniel and how he receives it. And so we see this starting in the beginning. It says, "In the third year of Cyrus, king of Persia, a revelation was given to Daniel, who was called Belteshazzar. Its message was true, and it concerned a great war. The understanding of the message came to him in a vision." All right, so right away we see that this is taking place. We get our timeline. Remember, we've kind of jumped around in the timeline. We're still in the third year of Cyrus, king of Persia, which was the same time period back in Daniel. I'm sorry, we're a little bit later. Than Daniel chapter 9 was the first year. So we went from the third year of Belshazzar and 8, the first year of Darius, king of son of Xerxes, a Mede, and now we're up to the third year of Cyrus. So we're a little bit later in time here. And so Daniel's getting older at this point, and so he's starting to get some information given to him. Now, we're about to get into a vision that is quite possibly the most contentious one amongst scholars, because Daniel chapter 11 is so specific. And it's that specificity that really drives people crazy about it, because the issue that we get into is, like we talked from the very first time we started talking about Daniel, you've got either the writing of it in the 530 BC range, or it's going to have to be written in 160-something BC. There's really no in-between. Nothing would make sense. If it was smack dab in the middle, then you'd have to just believe that there is still a massive amount of detail in the future, and then there would still be issues kind of in the past. Now, regardless of, even if you put it at 165 BC, they're all able to pick up on when the church was started in the future. They're all able to, no matter when it was written, all interpretations of writing time. You cannot eliminate prophecy out of Daniel. As much as you can try, they can push the writing date so far forward that they can push it ahead of chapter 11. And then this big act of faith has to happen that it was able to be spread so rapidly across so many different places and accepted as canon in so many different places in such a short period of time that it ends up in the writings of the Maccabees and found in the Dead Sea Scrolls. So if that were in fact the case, that it was able to be spread that much, then maybe, just maybe, they've got a case that Daniel chapter 10 and 11 was more fictional. I don't buy it, though. I'll be honest, I just don't buy that. Because first of all, you'd have to assume that God can tell the future when it's simpler, but he can't tell the future for us when it's specific. And that just doesn't make sense. First of all, that's like saying, well, God, you have the clairvoyance of the future only when it's convenient for us to, well, we'll buy that one. That makes us more comfortable. And so there's some issues there. The other thing that we get into with that is I think we have to wrap our minds first around eternity, which is hard to do. But when God says he's the same yesterday, today, and forever, and when God says, I am the God of Isaac, and Jacob and Abraham and all, he's using all these present tense terms because he's there at all moments right now. We live in a timeline. He does not. He is outside the realm of time. Now, how does that work? I mean, if you want to think of him as like the one way, I guess you could think of it as he's the middle kind of hub of a tire, and all these spokes go out to different time periods, and that wheel is all of time happening around it, but he's always there, and he can see all of it simultaneously because he's there connected to all periods of time. We have to be able to step back from time as a line that we live in our realm and understand that he lives in a different realm, so to speak, that he supersedes time. So when he's telling about the future, he just looks at it and he says, this is what's happening. And so he can be as specific as he wants to be. Sometimes he doesn't decide to get very specific with us. And sometimes, like in Daniel chapter 11, when we get to that, he gets extremely specific. And so there's going to be some things that we're going to see happening there. Because it's uniquely specific, a lot of people just automatically want to jump to the easy out and say, well, it's not right. It was written afterward. And of course they had all these details. There's another issue why those details would be really difficult. How well, without a museum, without a degree in history, could you tell me the specific things that happened in the life of, let's just use our own country. What happened between, Zachary Taylor, President Taylor, and his, inner workings and stuff like that? And what about Abraham Lincoln and his wife and, children? I don't know those details. And if I were to go down and write a book about it, where would I find that information? If I were living in a society where I didn't have historical records right before me, where would I have come up with the information that would have been lost over time until discovered through archaeological finds and things? So there's a lot of things that really scream out that this is written in the 500s BC. Okay. So I've asked Josh to read us a couple verses here, the next couple of them, chapter 10, verse 2 and 3. I'm ready if you're ready. All right, Josh, good job. Thank you. All right, so here he is. He's going to, throughout the chapter, he's going to continually give us this picture of this terrifying experience that he had on receiving this vision. The vision in and of itself is tremendous, but the experience of which he receives it is what this chapter is largely about. On the 24th day of the first month, as I was standing on the bank of the great river, the Tigris, I looked up, and there before me was a man dressed in linen, with a belt of fine gold from Uphaz around his waist. His body was like topaz, and his face like lightning, his eyes like flashing torches, his arms and legs like the gleam of burnished bronze, and his voice like the sound of a multitude. You know when they redid the Capitol Dome, and like every now and then you'd catch the sunlight off of that for the first few weeks, that burnished bronze, or the copper in that case. I think this gleam, of like almost hurts your eyes kind of a gleam is what we're seeing there. His face like lightning. I don't know, lightning is so bright. And you think, how is it that was, and his eyes were like flaming torches. He's trying to use this picture to describe. He's wearing linen, but everything else about him is just absolutely glowing, fiery, just blindingly light. And when he talked, his voice sounded like more than just one person. He sounded like a crowd, a multitude of people talking simultaneously. I think when he saw this man across, at the Tigris, and right before him, I don't know if he came off the water, if he came from the side of it. He's just right there by the water. He's laying out this picture. I would say this is probably hauntingly terrifying to look at with your own eyes, which is actually what we see every time we see these incidences take place. We see this terror that is set in. He says, I, Daniel, was the only one who saw the vision. Those who were with me did not see it, but such terror overwhelmed them that they fled and hid themselves. That part I can't wrap my mind around. If I'm there with Daniel and I don't see anything, is it just Daniel's reaction to what he's seen that terrifies me? Or is there some sense of what they're in the presence of, even though they can't see it, but they could still somewhat sense it, that allowed that terror to kick in for them so that they flee and hide themselves? Daniel's there looking at this terrifyingly majestic being right before him, this man in linen. And so he sees this. So I was left alone, gazing at this great vision. I had no strength left. My face turned deathly pale, and I was helpless. Then I heard him speaking, and as I listened to him, I fell into a deep sleep, my face to the ground. This is I think if we could really wrap our minds around what he's actually experienced here. For Daniel to have already heard over the years all of these times that God spoke through visions and dreams, he himself has had visions given to him. This one's different, which is to be expected. There's also something different about the actual vision itself. There's something more to this one that we see coming in. So his vision is very similar to what we see oftentimes when someone encounters, whether it's a messenger or an angel. There's always this response of fear. What was the first thing that when they came to the open tomb of Christ, what was the first thing that the angel said? Fear not. It's always, don't be afraid, because that's the natural response. We have these images of these, very quaint little porcelain angels on in a little knick-knack shelf or whatever like that. That is not the visions that we see here. These are terrifying things to see. It's otherworldly in the sense of not of this world, and not alien otherworldly, but it's otherworldly, otherrealmly, maybe is the better word to say. It's this vision or sight of something that is beyond our understanding. To look into this other dimension is a frightening from our appearance. We're so used to what we see. We're so used to what things look like in our realm that to see the other realm from our vantage point always strikes fear and terror into the people when they first see them, and often completely exhausts them, wipes them out, falling to the ground, losing their energy, falling into sleep. We see this time and time again. This is what this encounter is with it. It's interesting because you can almost use that as a way to weed out the false visions that people say they have. Interestingly, how many people who have these visions don't have this experience? It's like, well, that doesn't sound much like anything we've ever read about. When you read about it in Scripture, these experiences where they come into contact with a messenger or an angelic being, the fear that is caught up with them is pretty substantial. A hand touched me and set me trembling on my hands and knees. So there he is in a deep sleep, and I don't know if he just kind of picks them up and stands them up into a kind of a down on all fours kind of position. And he said, Daniel, you who are highly esteemed, consider carefully the words I'm about to speak to you, and stand up, for I have now been sent to you. And when he said this to me, I stood up trembling. And so he's regained some of his strength through that. He's now standing up trembling in before this glowing, fiery, lightning-like, blazing torched eyes, topaz-bodied linen. Who can describe it in words that we could fathom? And he says, then he continued, do not be afraid, Daniel, since the first day that you set your mind to gain understanding and to humble yourself before your God, your words were heard. And I have come in response to them. But the prince of the Persian kingdom resisted me 21 days. Then Michael, one of the chief princes, came to help me, because I was detained there with the king of Persia. Now I have come to explain to you what will happen to your people in the future, for the vision concerns a time yet to come. Okay, and herein lies the interesting part, as we start to get into the strange vision of this one. Obviously, it's a future occurrence. I mean, that's clear from the text, that he's going to tell him about that. But what is going on in this other realm that he was detained for 21 days? Well, first of all, who is the king of Persia? It's not Xerxes. It's not Cyrus. Otherwise, he would have just said, well, Cyrus, the king Cyrus, it's his third year of his reign. He held on to it. Who would this king of Persia that Michael would have to come and get this messenger out of detainment from? Who would this be? Any guesses? Wild stabs in the dark? Anything? I don't know that it's Satan himself, but it's one of his tools or his instruments that he's using there. Demons, if you want to think of it that way. So the prince of this world is Satan, and so he's going to put in the spiritual fight. He's got princes over all of this world, and they're going to fight to try to win on their cause of things. And obviously God sends his angels to steer things and win on his side. And so there's this battle that we don't quite understand. We're given a little glimpse there that there's this battle that was ongoing just to get the message to Daniel. They didn't want Daniel to hear this message. because they had other plans, not God's plan. And so they tried to detain him. Michael shows up on the scene, probably from our understanding, one of the most powerful of the angels, if they have more power. I mean, I guess that's the best way to look at it. So he's able to come in and kind of rescue him into that. Now he gets to show up on scene at the Tigris River with Daniel, and he gives him this vision. So we get this little glimpse into the other side, so to speak, the spiritual realm in this vision. We see just a little bit of what it might look like there, that God is at work as he's delivering his messenger to Daniel, and the prince of this world is using his forces to try to slow that message down or stop that message from being delivered, because it is a message of encouragement to Daniel about what's going to happen to his people in the future. If you look at it in the long scheme of it, what happens to God's people is a good thing. It goes through some rough patches, but the whole long big picture is here we are this morning. It's a good thing. It gets us to here. And so this is where he's trying to have this understanding given to Daniel that there are going to be some bad things happen. Remember, they're still in captivity at this time. And he wants them to know good things are still coming for your people. There are positive things still ahead, and there's a lot of transitions to get us there. And I'm going to tell you about some of those. And as you see those happening, some of which are going to be extremely frustrating for my people, this is what I want you to understand, where it's going through that and how the path is woven its way through, and it's going to get very specific on how it's going to get there. All right, so back to the text. While he was saying this to me, I bowed with my face toward the ground and was speechless. Then one who looked like a man touched my lips, and I opened my mouth and began to speak. I said to the one standing before me, I'm overcome with anguish because of the vision, my Lord, and I feel very weak. How can I, your servant, talk with you, my Lord? My strength is gone, and I can hardly breathe. Again, this is his response to receiving this vision from this man. And he's weakened. He's struggling even to cope with the reception of it, let alone the interpretation of it. Again, the one who looked like a man touched me and gave me strength. Do not be afraid, you who are highly esteemed, he said. Peace. Be strong now. Be strong. And so he strengthens him. And again, the Lord's the only one who can give us that strength. And so this is some manifestation, possibly. It's so, it's so, how to say it? It's so heavenly in the way he's described. We could instantly want to jump into, this must be some manifestation of Christ. But then that seems unusual that he would have been detained in that sense, that he wouldn't have had that power. So maybe it's not him. But regardless of whoever it is, he has been given enough authority by God to be able to impart strength unto Daniel. He's been able to give this now, get him past the fear part, get him past the weakened, can hardly breathe, trembling, can't hardly stand up, to now be strong, listen to what I'm about to say, and take these words in, understand them. When he spoke to me, I was strengthened and said, speak, my Lord, since you've given me strength. And now you see a different Daniel. He's now been emboldened, strengthened, and he's ready for this vision to be given to him at this point. So he said, do you know why I have come to you? Soon I will return to fight against the prince of Persia. And when I go, the prince of Greece will come. And again, we see this. Now, remember, all through all these visions, we have seen time and time again, from the Babylonian to the Medo-Persian to the Greek Empire to the Roman Empire, on the visions of four things during the Nebuchadnezzar's dream of a statue. We see the four different beasts that come out, and we see the same interpretation. We sometimes see it just between these two, the two middle empires, the Medo-Persian and the Greek Empire, and how that ram and the goat were kind of used in one of the visions given as well. And so he's still talking about the same thing. It hasn't happened yet. They're still in the time period of the Medo-Persian Empire. And he said, and things are coming to a head here. And he says, I'm about to go back, and I'm going to fight against the prince of Persia. And when I go, the prince of Greece will come. So, interestingly, as we're going to see, what did the Greek Empire do? And this is kind of just thought process, kind of thinking now that in hindsight. What did the Greek Empire really do to pave the way for Christ? It did help to create one commonality that was, you took tribal kind of mentality of everybody. And the one thing that the Greeks did was they tried to Hellenize the world, which was make them Greek. And so this Hellenistic approach of making everyone like them, one, it was this unifying way of doing this. And so it allowed for a lot of that to be built. Yeah.
It also provided the assistance of one language.
Yeah. One language was extremely helpful. We see that, how much useful that is in the New Testament, to be so much of it written in Greek that could then be passed along from one group to another because of that. It's like what English does for the world right now. You can't take the importance of the English language out of modern society right now. Without it, there would be this woven thread that would be taken away, and it would unravel more. And so having that ability to communicate with a larger number of people was because of this. So you can see how God's going to use them. Now, the other thing they did is they essentially set up an enormous empire, which then will give way to an enormous Roman Empire, which gives the ability for the disciples and the apostles to do so much travel around the world within that empire, and the spread is going to be allowed. Well, in order for that spread to happen, there needs to be somebody come on the scene to take over all that land. Well, there's where Greece is going to come in on that one. But first, I will tell you what is written in the book of truth. No one supports me against them except Michael, your prince. And so a lot of people are against this, but he's pushing for this. And how does that look? I don't know. Nobody can stand up before you and tell you what the other realm looks like when we haven't seen it. And I don't even know that he could have fully explained to Daniel at that moment exactly what it looks like. He's trying to explain to them, no one supports me against them except Michael, your prince. And in the first year of Darius the Mede, I took my stand to support and protect him. Okay, so we see that he's, since the Medes came in, he's been kind of supporting that, but then now he's got to go back against the king of Persia. And what's going on here in this part? That we are not given a whole lot of insight into. From here, though, what we are going to see is the earthly battles and the earthly changes that we're going to see play out. And that's really where Daniel 11 switches over to. That's the very first verse of Daniel chapter 11. And so since we have a little bit of time, Daniel chapter 10 in and of itself doesn't actually contain the vision. It contains the how much, was he frightened and then re-strengthened by the vision. But we get into this extremely detailed vision in 11 where it was essentially, if you really read through what he was talking about, he basically just told him that Persia is going to fall, which he's been told already. He's been told that then the ram is going to come in referencing to Greek Empire on different visions. And so then Greece is going to follow. So this isn't new, actually back even to Nebuchadnezzar's visions. That has been the ongoing theme through all of this, is that Babylonians will give way to the Medo-Persian Empire gives way to the Greeks, and the Greeks will eventually give way to the Roman Empire. And it's during that time that God has some very big plans for his people, because everything, all the groundwork will have been laid just correctly. You've got the Babylonian Empire, which was needed to train his people to be back on track. They got taken into captivity to learn to follow him. They never really left him as much afterward. After Babylonian captivity, the Israelites, from everything we can see, were more committed than they were prior to that. It really did change them. And it did exactly what he needed it to do. And so it got them more on the path so that his people were often getting into the realm of self-righteousness, like the Pharisees, or often to different branches or whatever, but at least they were following him for the most part. So you had that going on. Then you have the Medo-Persian Empire, which very importantly had rules that could never be changed, and that allowed them to return home and have everything rebuilt on that nation's dime. So everything was paid for, and they get to come back and reestablish, after they learned their lesson, God has Jerusalem back. And so that happens during the Medo-Persians. You don't need the Medo-Persians for much after that. Get rid of them and get a guy who can come and gather all the land under his control. Quite possibly the best military leader the world has ever seen, and some of his tactics are still taught in military academies to this day. He was that good. Never once did that Greek leader lose a single battle. Never one time. Crazy to think that. Never lost a single battle. So that allowed then the land grab, if you want to think of it like that, to take place. And then the common language and that kind of tying in and unification of a large part of the world that was very disjointed started happening. And then the Romans came in, took that, modified it ever so slightly and said, yeah, but they can still practice their own religion. And then that was allowing then for more of the Jewish religion to resurge, and it allowed for the development of the church and the Christian religion under their umbrella. And so that's really where God saw all of that. He had it all planned out. So the next several verses, as we get into 11, become really, really specific on how this is going to play itself out. So now then, I tell you the truth. 3 more kings will arise in Persia, and then a 4th who will be far richer than all the others. When he has gained power by his wealth, he will stir up everyone against the kingdom of Greece. Then a mighty king will arise, who will rule with great power and do as he pleases. After he has arisen, his empire will be broken up and parceled out toward the 4 winds of heaven. It will not go to his descendants, nor will it have the power he exercised, because his empire will be uprooted and given to others. All right, so one thing that could be easily misread into this is that 4th king of Persia is not the last king of Persia, but he starts the process of the downfall of the Achaemenid or the Medo-Persian Empire. He really is he starts its downfall. And again, here's the Persian kings. So we're at Cyrus the Great, and it says 3 more are going to come: Cambyses II, Bardiya, and then Darius the First. All right, but then the 4th one, Xerxes. He attacks Greece. He attacks Greece and fails, and he makes Greece mad. And that's all it's going to take. Once they get a good leader in place who can take over, Persia's days are numbered now. They have not done a good thing by going in and attack for their own good. They've not done something that's going to be helpful for them. And so they end up going in and attacking Greece, failing to it. Now, you may remember Xerxes, Ahasuerus, another name for him that's thrown out in Scripture. You'll read that. He's the same one that marries Esther. How did he end up marrying Esther? What happens at the very beginning of that? Do you remember the first chapter of Esther? What was happening during that time? He threw a 6-month-long party to all of the nobles and everything, partying up. And Queen Vashti wouldn't come dance for them. And so that's how he got rid of Queen Vashti, and then Esther through Mordecai and all that. The rest of that story happens. That's all during Xerxes. That's that 4th king being talked about in Daniel. The one who is richer than all the others. So rich that he throws a 6-month-long party celebrating his richness and his wealth. This is exactly what was being talked about there. And so we see that playing itself out. Now, the Jews are kind of protected through this whole time period. And so when the Greeks come in, or when he goes after the Greeks, which is not recorded in Scripture, but historically we know that Xerxes goes after them and he fails, then we still have Artaxerxes, Darius, and Artaxerxes II, which some of those come into play in the rebuilding, because if you look at the time period there, they will show up during the book of Ezra and Nehemiah, where there's the rebuilding of the temple and the rebuilding of Jerusalem and its walls. So there was still a need, because way back during the time of Cyrus, something was written down saying they can go back. I'll allow the Jews to return. Not only do they return, but we're going to pay for it. They're given safe passage through the Trans-Euphrates, all these other promises that were given to them. And when things started to go bad, it was during the years of Artaxerxes that they realized that, and they go back and they fix all those problems, and everything's able to be rebuilt. So a lot happens during that time under the Medo-Persian Empire. Sometimes it's one of those empires we forget. It's not that we always think about the Babylonian Empire and Egypt and all this stuff. But a whole lot of extremely important part of Jewish history leading us up to the days of Christ came out of the Medo-Persian Empire. And of course, the great Greek that is being talked about there, really no question. Verse 4 is most clearly talking about Alexander the Great. No doubt he was the biggest militaristic leader. He had the biggest conquest known in history, essentially, especially in the short period of time that he happened. He ends up dying at the age of 32. There's some question of whether or not it was an illness he got, whether he had drank water that had been poisoned on purpose with a slow-acting poison, because it takes 11 to 14 days after that before he dies. And so for the next 2 weeks, they treat him and treat him and treat him. And I read you that quote that he was dying from the treatment of too many physicians. They tried and tried and tried. There's some stories that he was propped up, could no longer talk, paralyzed. He's now unable to talk, and his people came by and he would just wave at them. Like, that's how he was saying his goodbyes. Like, it was talk about a fall from greatness. And it was all over either he was poisoned. That's not as popular of a thought. That's more of a more recent thinking that maybe there's some things that they would have known about during the days of antiquity, that they would have known how to slow poison somebody with a couple different plants that could have done it. Or, which is, he could have caught some other illness. Could have been West Nile virus, honestly, is one of the likely ways in which he died. Like, he could have had any number of things that he caught, and it very well could have been a form of an alcohol poisoning that triggered a lot of other bodily things that were going on, some other illness that kicked in. Regardless of what it was, he dies. And when he dies, his heir had not been born. She was still pregnant with his son to be born. And so at the time of his death, he has no heir. So it gets divided up to 4 generals: Cassander, Ptolemy, Antigonus, and Seleucus. Now, of those, you're really only going to hear about the north and the south, Ptolemy and the Seleucids. And those are the only 2 that are going to be then talked about through the remainder of Daniel chapter 11, because those are the 2 on either side of Israel fighting over the beautiful land, the Beulah land there, that they are going back and forth trying to see who takes over Israel. Obviously, that's all that really matters at this point for this group of people, because what was he told? This concerns your people on times that have yet to come. And so we're going to see how this back and forth keeps going across Israel the whole time. And we're going to see that play itself out in Daniel chapter 11. But we're out of time for this morning, so that's where we'll leave it there. And Daniel chapter 11, I will, if I can find a good way to do it, because it's so specific, I may even provide a handout next time, because the amount of detail is not going to even be conducive for just that alone. So we'll wrap it up there. And if you see the youth group departing here shortly, make sure you tell them a goodbye for the week and encourage them as they head up to York. So we'll end there this morning.